it really is going to come down to the sort of advantages in internal data sets that the company has access to today.
Welcome to TBR Talks, decoding strategies and ecosystems of the globe's top tech firms, where we talk business model disruption in the broad technology ecosystem. From management consultancies to systems integrators, hyperscalers to independent software vendors, telecom operators to network and infrastructure vendors, and chip manufacturers to value-added resellers. We'll be answering some of the key intelligence questions we've heard from executives and business unit leaders among the leading professional services, IT, and telecom vendors. I'm Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst, and today we'll be talking about generative AI and data access with Alex Demeule, Analyst for TBR's Cloud and Software Practice. So Alex, we've been talking on this podcast seemingly relentlessly about generative AI, but we're also, when we're talking to our clients, in particular the services vendors, the cloud vendors, even the hardware vendors, the story always starts with data and how important data is, and then immediately jumps to something else. Like everybody wants to talk about what they do rather than to talk about the actual core of artificial intelligence, the actual core of a lot of enterprises, which is the data. So from your perspective, what are you seeing with respect to how the vendors that you cover and how generative AI really in the whole ecosystem is handling data questions?
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of data is the new oil is just such a recurring theme and has been for really the entire length of the Gen AI conversation. I think it's something that the whole market really came to terms with pretty quickly. And when we think about data access, it's a really good indicator of what vendors are going to be in a competitive advantage, as well as what sort of steps these vendors need to take to sort of ensure that their generative AI development strategy is feasible, right? Data access really is proving to be sort of a choke point for many, right? Like when we look at the large language model vendors, and this is sort of a area outside of my expertise, given that I'm focusing mostly on the enterprise SaaS players, but they're facing a reckoning right now. For many years before generative AI entered sort of the mainstream and the main conversation, they had a lot of freedom to go out into these public data pools on the internet and scrape the data and train their large language models. And now it's starting to come back and bite them because we're seeing these lawsuits from the New York Times and other different content creators. And I think this sort of wild west around data access has really come to an end. And as that comes to an end, vendors are going to need to really look at how are we forming partnerships? How are we licensing data? How are we using the data that we have access to internally to promote our generative AI strategy? And, to bring it back to the enterprise SaaS, because that's really what I spend so much of my time looking at, these are vendors that have access to a lot of workflow specific data. Like when we think about embedding generative AI into their existing platforms, they really are set up fairly well to do that fairly quickly. And I think that that has been a big driver of a lot of the early tools that we've seen come to market. Obviously, these are tools that, are still in their infancy and still emerging and are going to have to prove their value to the enterprise. But, I do think that in a lot of ways, these SaaS vendors and the SaaS leaders that have been working within their workflows for decades now are in a pretty good position, at least when it comes to workflow specific automation. There, there's going to be a lot of things that need to happen when I think about industry specific generative AI development and how a company like Salesforce looks outside of, general CRM. How do they do manufacturing CRM? What sort of manufacturing data sets does Salesforce have to go and find access to in order to develop their emerging portfolios for something like the manufacturing cloud? That is going to be a barrier and something that's going to be driving a lot of their ecosystem development going forward.
I want to come back to 2 points. One, to talk about specific vendors, and you mentioned Salesforce, and we'll bring up some others. I also want to come back to this idea of the industry large language models or an industry specific generative AI solution. But I want to start with a bigger kind of question, which is last year, at this time last year, when we were talking about generative AI, the hype, the excitement, all of that was around these large language models that were built on these large data sets that, as you've talked about now, that Wild West day is over. There's no longer the ability to just go out and grab everything, right? So which is a result of IP and governance, risk, and compliance. There's a lot of reasons why that was great. It kind of kickstarted a lot of the excitement around generative AI, but it also was going to be short-lived. But within the enterprise, data is such a rich source of opportunity if that data is managed, if it's warehoused, if it's analyzed. All of those concerns. Are there certain things that you see the vendors that you look at? Are there certain things that you think they're exceptionally good at handling with respect to data management? Or do you think there's a big opportunity here for others to step in and say, we can handle the data part, you just handle the platform part or the cloud part or whatever other element to it?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the SaaS players have been investing at the PaaS layer and kind of going outside of their core competencies for years now, right? And, I guess stay on the Salesforce example, Data Cloud is their fastest growing cloud ever for any of their suites. And they have obviously grown into the SaaS leader and the overall SaaS leader. And so the fact that now their data offering is their fastest growing cloud ever really speaks volumes.
Right.
And that really will set them up well for handling enterprise data at scale and being able to sort of internally take that data and be able to leverage it into the generative AI tools that they're starting to form. That being said, you're never going to be able to do the entire data story on a Salesforce data cloud. And when we look at the vendors, Databricks and Snowflake, the partnerships that are forming kind of across the market to ensure that there's these unified data pipelines, just such a recurring theme, and they're always going to be needed in that conversation. As I think when we think about enterprise-wide data, they're really going to be the vendors that are capable in that. They're the ones that are going to be able to look at not just CRM data, but OT data and HR data and kind of a enterprise-wide view of data.
Right, and financial data, the knowledge management, all that. So that to me is really fascinating because an enterprise doesn't have one data set. It has multiple, not necessarily conflicting, but multiple and in very different kind of colors and flavors. So while you could talk about using a generative AI enhanced Salesforce solution in your enterprise or a generative AI enhanced SAP solution, those two don't necessarily talk together. Maybe you don't want them to, but maybe you do. And if you do, is there anybody that is sort of saying, this is how we're going to marry your SAP data, your Salesforce data, your OT data, your connectivity data, like your own internal, like your data set that you built up, your sort of internal data set that's bespoke and special to your enterprise? Is there anyone that has that capability now?
Yeah, I think that the data specialists and even the hyperscalers are sort of trying to attack that opportunity. We just talked about Databricks and Snowflake, but Microsoft obviously is a name that is kind of recurring all the time in the generative AI story. And you look at the Microsoft Fabric and the data fabric approach that they have been developing for years now, but really launched just in the end of 2023. That is all about unifying enterprise-wide data. Their One Lake solution that sits at the foundation, they call it the OneDrive for the enterprise. And really what they're trying to do is create a single UI where you're able to look at all these different data sets from across LOBs and business units and look at it from really a low-code, no-code perspective, right? And that's something that has really stood out to me as well as a differentiator for kind of what they're looking at. And obviously, low code and no code has been a recurring theme that we've seen in many different places at the past layer. But really, kind of going all in, ensuring that business leaders and the ones with the domain knowledge have access and they're able to look at the data sets that they have available to them and sort of looking at it from the whole data pipeline perspective, that is really going to create this sort of emphasis on the domain knowledge. Now it's no longer that the enterprise is constricted by their technical resources on their data teams, but it's creating room for these business leaders that have understanding and ownership of the workflows to really be in charge of how this data is moving from the data warehouse all the way through the generative AI tool, which, and it's to me a generative AI tool that they're helping to, bring to life and not being able to identify the areas that automation makes the most sense and automation can add the most value to the enterprise.
Right, and so then you have access. You also have permission. That's another area that there's an important difference here between those two things. So, and when you talk about low code, no code, I think of from the user experience. So, ChatGPT is the ultimate, no code. I mean, you really true that, and that's part of what made generative AI take off in the sort of the public imagination. And so, and then I guess the last point on that is that and this is a segue into the industry discussion. When I think about Microsoft, I don't think of them as being having specific solutions for specific industries. But if they are the leader in how you wrangle all of that data from all the different sources, does that create an opportunity or an opening for a Salesforce or somebody else to come in, or an SAP to come in and say, hey, we have the manufacturing generative AI solution that's specific to the manufacturing space or healthcare or financial services, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about Salesforce, I think has done a bit of a better job in sort of bringing their manufacturing cloud and creating, looking at their CRM and sort of bringing it to manufacturing. I don't necessarily, when I think about, data sets, I think that both Microsoft and Salesforce are going to have to look externally to partners to develop manufacturing focused Gen AI or really any of or most of the industry Gen AI use cases. Obviously, we talk about access to data, and that's really going to be a challenge for both. But like Microsoft definitely has assets of its own that will create opportunities for itself. I don't think about Microsoft as a big HR company, but Microsoft owns LinkedIn, which is such a workforce employment oriented social media platform that's very data rich. And we've already seen them beginning to tap into LinkedIn related data to support its Viva portfolio. And as the company goes deeper into sort of basically workflow and LOB specific generative AI, I think that data set is going to be a pretty big advantage. So again, not necessarily industry specific there, but it really is going to come down to the sort of advantages in internal data sets that the company has access to today.
Right. Fascinating stuff. This is really good, and I know we're going to chat again in a month or so, and we'll have some new questions for you. But I want to end with one that I like to ask on this podcast, and I haven't quite figured out how to phrase this exactly. I've been given some recommendations on how to change it up, but what I basically want to know is, you've been doing this for a while. What's a question that you just sort of that's always on your mind that you always want to try and find an answer to? What's the thing about the companies that you cover in particular that you really wish you knew?
Oh,
everybody has the same reaction.
A question that I wish I had the answer to.
You're in the boardroom with SAP. You're in the boardroom with Salesforce or ServiceNow. You're in the boardroom with Microsoft. What's your question for? What's driving those companies right now, or what's your question about, or where things are going to be in a year from now? We've had an entire year of hype around generative AI. Where are we going to be a year from now?
On this topic, one of the things that I feel like I wish I understood better from a leadership perspective at the SaaS vendors, at the Microsofts, what is the role that AI ethics plays at the corporate level? Because this is something that has taken on multiple different avenues, right? We've been talking about data a lot and data access. And obviously, that's starting to come to a front with lawsuits. The other side of it is, open source versus proprietary generative AI models. And what are the trade-offs for society at large by having these large language models be owned by a single entity? What are the long-term ramifications of that? We saw this come out ahead in the OpenAI leadership scuffle that happened back in November. You do a little research, and obviously that was led by the chief science officer at OpenAI. And you go look at interviews that he's done before, and he talks a lot about AI ethics. And I think that, that was really him looking at OpenAI and the strategy that they're taking and thinking that the leadership wasn't taking AI ethics seriously enough. And obviously in that case, the CEO, Altman, kind of ended up on top and being reinstated. So clearly the CSO's concerns weren't taken into account. Maybe they were, because he did get board support at the time, but it's always hard to tell, behind closed doors, what actually happened, what actually changed. So, understanding AI ethics, I think, is something that I love to read about and think about. And that's something that is definitely, not talked about a lot, because it's something that isn't necessarily on shareholders' minds all the time, because a proprietary model would add a lot to shareholder value. So it's really a stakeholder approach, but it's something that I think about a lot.
It's fascinating too, because we never had ethical discussions about blockchain, IoT, 5G, digital twin, maybe digital twin a little bit, but still, it's fascinating how generative AI took, and I know there was ethical AI discussions before, but when it became so popularized and democratized and everybody was talking about it, suddenly it was like, wait a minute, hold on, there is an ethical component here that needs more understanding. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. Alex, thank you very, very much. We will talk again soon.
Look forward to it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Next month, I'll be speaking with Alex again, talking about the key intelligence questions we'll be getting over this coming month. Tune in next week for another round of TBR Talks. Don't forget to send us your key intelligence questions on business strategy, ecosystems, and management through the form in the show notes below. Visit tbri.com to learn how we help tech companies large and small answer these questions with the research, data, and analysis my guests bring to this conversation every week. Once again, I'm your host, Patrick Heffernan, Principal Analyst at TBR. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week.